I want to turn to somebody else who may well have presidential ambitions and has been the subject of a lot of negativity. Meghan Markle, Prince Harry's wife, who does this podcast, Archewell podcast, or Archetypes it's called, in which she seems to perennially play the victim, the female victim of all outrages. And your name got dragged into this. Let's take a listen to what she said.
Raise your hand if you've ever been called crazy or hysterical. Or what about nuts, insane, out of your mind, completely irrational?
I don't think that men can control crazy women.
The use of these labels has been drilled into us from movies and TV, from friends and family, and even from random strangers. And the fact is, no one wants this label.
What did you make of that, Jordan, to be suddenly appearing on Meghan Markle's podcast as a villain
the first
who was
thing I make
calling women crazy?
Is that she... Yeah, well, the first thing I make of it is that her voice drips with the same falsehood that the voice of Kamala Harris drips with. It's this sanctimonious, faux compassionate, talking down to her audience and trying to be sure that we're all really on the same compassionate page here, and we're all being victimized by terrible forces that are arrayed against us, and none of that's really fair. And it just grates on me, and I do believe, you played a bit of a clip from me when I was talking to Camille Paglia, the literary critic, and I do believe that it is the case that it's very difficult to control female antisocial behavior, often of the type that's been pilloried as hysterical. And I think that there is no shortage of clinical evidence to support precisely that claim. It's very difficult for women to control female antisocial behavior, and females who are antisocial, that feminine pattern is reputation savaging under the guise of compassionate care. And it's extraordinarily destructive. And so I stand by my words.
Absolutely.
And I do think it scales online, because you can use an anonymous reputation savaging to unbelievably great effect online with absolutely no punishment for your sins, so to speak. And that is certainly one of the things that's contributing to so-called cancel culture. And there's no shortage of that coming from the female side. Now, men can engage in exactly the same strategies, and they do so online, and that's enabled. But it's definitely, see, with men, and I've said this before, and I do believe this to be the case, the ever-present threat of the potential for physical violence keeps men from doing that to each other most of the time in person. And that all disappears online, and that means that those who are prone to do such things, to use corrosive and denigrating derision, for example, and reputation savaging, can have a free hand at it, and that includes no shortage of women, and women are often, very, very often, the targets of that behavior from their own fellows, so to speak.
Raise your hand if you've ever been called crazy.
I don't think that men can control crazy women. This is something my wife has pointed out too. She said, well, men are going to have to stand up for themselves, but here's the problem. I know how to stand up to a man who's unfairly trespassing against me. And the reason I know that is because the parameters for my resistance are quite well defined, which is we talk, we argue, we push, and then it becomes physical, right? Like if we move beyond the boundaries of civil discourse, we know what the next step is. Okay, that's forbidden in discourse with women. And so I don't think that men can control crazy women. I really don't believe it. I think that they have to throw their hands up. There's no step forward that you can take under those circumstances, because if the man is offensive enough and crazy enough, the reaction becomes physical right away, or at least the threat is there. And when men are talking to each other in any serious manner, that underlying threat of physicality is always there, especially if it's a real conversation, and it keeps the thing civilized to some degree. For example, there's a woman in Toronto who's been organizing this movement, let's say, against me and some other people who are going to do a free speech event, and she managed to organize quite effectively. And she's quite offensive, you might say. She compared us to Nazis, for example, which, you know, publicly, using the swastika, which wasn't really something I was all that fond of. But I'm defenseless against that kind of female insanity, because the techniques that I would use against a man who was employing those tactics are forbidden to me. So I don't know, like, it seems to me that it isn't men that have to stand up and say enough of this, even though that is what they should do. It seems to me that it's sane women who have to stand up against their crazy sisters and say, look, enough of that, enough man-hating, enough pathology, enough bringing disgrace on us as a gender. But the problem there, and then I'll stop my little tirade, is that most of the women I know who are sane are busy doing sane things, right? They're off, they have their career, they have their family, they're quite occupied, and they don't seem to have the time or maybe even the interest to go after their crazy harpy sisters. And so I don't see any regulating force for that terrible femininity. And it seems to me to be invading the culture and undermining the masculine power of the culture in a way that's, I think, fatal.